Tracy Quartermain had not planned on coming home early. France was supposed to be her escape, a carefully curated retreat designed to remind her that she was still formidable, still in control, still the woman who could walk into any room and bend it to her will. The spa's mineral baths, the quiet terraces with their view of the French countryside, the carefully scripted days of massages and silence had been chosen precisely because they were worlds away from Port Charles chaos and Quartermain drama. Yet even in that manicured tranquility, the real world had a way of clawing its way back to her. It came in the form of a frantic phone call, a broken sentence about Ned collapsing outside Bobby's, emergency surgery, coronary bypass, and a name laced through every detail like a poison thread. Drew. By the time the line went dead, Tracy's robe was already on the floor and her suitcase was open. On the flight back, the hum of the engine could not drown out the storm in her mind. Ned had always been her sorest point of pride and vulnerability, a son whose brilliance and stubbornness mirrored her own too closely. She could accept that hearts failed and bodies wore down, but what she could not accept, what she refused to accept, was the idea that when Ned needed someone the most, the man who had been standing right there had chosen to walk away. The image she built in her mind was unforgiving. Ned collapsing on the pavement, clutching his chest, and Drew somehow turning his back. Whether it was entirely accurate or not hardly mattered. Once Tracy's sense of betrayal locked onto a target, facts became secondary to the narrative she could not let go of. She replayed every moment of Drew's rise in the Quartermain orbit, every decision that had pushed Ned aside, every alliance that had favored Drew's ambitions over Ned's legacy, and by the time the plane touched down, her anger had hardened into something sharp and purposeful. The Quartermain mansion greeted her with a strange, uneasy quiet, the kind of hush that only fell when everyone was waiting for the next crisis shoe to drop. The staff moved around carefully, voices low, as though even the clinking of silverware might be too loud. Tracy was barely through the door before she was demanding updates, her heels echoing on the polished floors as if she were marching into battle. She was told Ned had survived the surgery. Words like coronary bypass, stable, and recovering tumbled out, but they did little to soften the image in her mind of him lying on an operating table, chest open, while she was getting mud wraps and mineral facials. Guilt flickered through her, unwelcome and brief, and she immediately redirected it into something she could manage far better: blame. It was only when she heard Gio's name that her tirade paused. Gio had been the one who reacted first when Ned went down, they said. He had seen the color drain from Ned's face, heard the slur in his voice, noticed the way his hand went to his chest. While others froze in that suspended second of shock, Gio had moved. He had shouted for help, called 911, followed the paramedics, stayed at the hospital, refused to leave the waiting room. It was Gio who had insisted the doctors look again when something in the initial assessment didn't sit right. It was Gio who had done what Quartermains were rarely good at in crisis: listen, observe, and prioritize the person over the power struggle. Tracy had never paid much attention to him before beyond treating him as another addition orbiting the family's gravitational pull, but suddenly his quiet presence took on a new weight in her mind. Ned's recovery in the hospital was a fragile, carefully measured process. The beeping machines, the steady drip of medication, the pale cast of his skin all testified to how close they had come to losing him. When Tracy finally stood at his bedside, she was not the impenetrable matriarch the world usually saw. For a fleeting moment, one she would never admit to later, she allowed herself to absorb the sight of him with raw vulnerability. This was her son, stitched back together, his heart forced to work harder and differently than it had before. His breathing was shallow but even, and every rise and fall of his chest felt like a negotiation between his body and fate. There was no room in that moment for stock values, corporate battles, or the eternal question of who controlled what at ELQ. There was only Ned, and the terrifying reality that they had almost lost him. But Quatermain's did not sit in vulnerability for long. It always curdled into something else: resentment, resolve, vengeance, anything that allowed them to feel powerful again. It did not take long for Ned, once he was lucid and well enough to register more than the immediate pain, to find a name to tether his hurt to. Drew. The story of what had happened outside Bobby's had already trickled into his room, fragmented through retellings, colored by bias and tension. Ned remembered flashes: tightness in his chest, dizziness, a sensation of falling, voices shouting, someone's hands on him, sirens in the distance. But what stuck with him most was what he had been told afterward, that Drew hadn't stayed, hadn't been there when the chaos settled, hadn't followed through at the moment Ned needed support. Whether Drew had truly abandoned him or had been pulled in another direction was irrelevant. In Ned's post-surgical fog, the narrative settled in cruelly and stubbornly. Drew had left him. Drew had chosen something, or someone, else over the man who had once been his rival, his ally, and his unwilling mirror. That wound went deeper than physical pain. Ned had watched Drew rise in the company and the family, watched him take on roles that had once belonged solely to Ned, watched him cultivate trust and loyalty from people who used to turn to Ned first. The collapse outside Bobby's crystallized all those old grievances into an accusation that felt as sharp as a scalpel. When it truly mattered, Drew was not at his side. Recovering from open-heart surgery, with his body stitched and fragile, Ned found his emotional defenses stripped raw. Old insecurities about his place in the family, his significance at ELQ, his sense of being replaceable all bled into a single, corrosive conviction that he had been left alone in the moment between life and death. Tracy absorbed every bitter word and did what she did best: she weaponized them. She might have been halfway across the world when her son collapsed, but she would not allow anyone to see that as neglect on her part. Instead, she shifted the focus with surgical precision. In conversations at the mansion and in hushed discussions in hospital corridors, she made sure Drew's name was never far from the center of blame. She spoke in a tone that seemed almost reasonable, almost measured, but was laced with judgment. She questioned his priorities, his choices, the timing of his departure from the scene. She reminded anyone who would listen of the long chain of events that had led to Drew's elevated position in the Quatermain orbit, painting each step as one more move that had pushed Ned toward the margins. In Tracy's mind, Drew's alleged abandonment was not just a single choice, it was the culmination of a larger betrayal. He had benefited from Ned's missteps, from corporate reshuffles, from a family eager to embrace a safer alternative when Ned's own decisions had come under fire. Now, as Ned lay recovering from a surgery that might haunt him for the rest of his life, Tracy saw an opportunity to restore the balance as she believed it should be. Drew would not emerge from this unscathed if she had anything to say about it. Whether through boardroom maneuvers, public shaming, or private confrontation, she would make sure he felt the weight of what she had decided was his moral failure. Yet even as she sharpened her knives for Drew, Tracy could not ignore the contrast that Gio presented. Here was someone who had not been born into the Quartermain legacy, who did not have a decades-long stake in ELQ's fortunes, who had no reason to see Ned's survival as anything other than a human necessity. And still, when everything went sideways, Gio had stepped in without hesitation. The more Tracy learned, the more she replayed the account of his actions in her head. He had recognized the signs, reacted quickly, refused to be brushed aside by assumptions that it was just stress. He had insisted something was seriously wrong, and that insistence had shaved critical minutes off the response time. The surgeons had confirmed as much, those minutes had mattered. Pride was not an emotion Tracy liked to indulge in unless it was directed at herself, but in Gio's case, she allowed it a small foothold. Publicly, she remained brisk and composed, offering a curt nod in his direction, acknowledging his role in the chain of events that had saved Ned's life. Privately, however, her appreciation ran deeper. In a family that had built its empire on ruthless calculation, Gio's instinctive decency stood out like a flare. He had done what so many Quartermains claimed to do but so often failed at: he had put a person before a power play. That, to Tracy, made him valuable in a way that spreadsheets and voting shares could not measure. In the weeks that followed, the Quartermain mansion became a battlefield of quiet glances, half-finished sentences, and conversations that carried barbs beneath their surface. Drew would eventually walk through those doors, and when he did, he would find a house reorganized around Ned's fragility and Tracy's vendetta. Every interaction would be weighed and measured, every explanation he tried to offer filtered through a lens of suspicion. The truth of what had happened outside Bobby's, why he left, what he knew, what he didn't, might be more nuanced than anyone wanted to hear, but nuance rarely survived long in the firestorm of Quartermain emotions. Ned's recovery would be marked not only by physical milestones but by emotional recalibrations. His anger toward Drew, his gratitude toward Gio, his awareness of how close he came to not waking up again, all of it would reshape how he saw the people around him. Tracy, meanwhile, would stand at the center of it all, orchestrating reactions, steering conversations, and making sure that the story that took root in Port Charles was the one that served her purposes. Her son almost died, Drew failed him, and Gio stepped up. In that narrative, there were clear villains and clear heroes, and Tracy had already decided who would occupy which role. In a town where memories are long and grudges even longer, the fallout from Ned's heart surgery would reverberate far beyond the hospital walls. It would bleed into boardroom decisions, family loyalty tests, and late-night confrontations when masks slipped and truth surged to the surface. The collapse outside Bobby's had been a single moment, a terrifying flash in time, but its consequences were sprawling. Somewhere at the center of it lay a man with a newly mended heart and a family that refused to let the crisis fade quietly into the past. And as always in the Quartermaine world, survival was only the beginning. The real drama would come in how they chose to live with what had almost been lost.